Imagine walking alone through a dense, snow-covered forest and suddenly spotting a massive grizzly bear. But instead of attacking, it's carrying a human baby in its mouth. Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you do the unthinkable and try to save the child? This is exactly what happened to Jack, a dedicated forest ranger who spent his life protecting wildlife. But nothing could prepare him for the shocking discovery that day: a grizzly bear, instead of being a threat, was guarding something precious, a baby lost and helpless. What was the bear's intention? And how did the child end up in the forest in the first place? This incredible story will challenge everything you thought you knew about nature, survival, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Stay with us until the end, you won't believe what happens next. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story like this. Now, let's dive into this unbelievable tale. Jack had always felt at home in the wilderness. As a forest ranger, he knew every trail, every hidden cave, and every whisper of the wind in the towering pines. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness. It was a crisp winter morning, and Jack was making his usual patrol through the Yukon wilderness. He moved carefully, his boots crunching against the freshly fallen snow. Reports of predators in the area had increased, and Jack was on high alert. Then, he saw movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. A large, shadowy figure emerged between the trees, its heavy frame moving with purpose. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was a grizzly bear. But something was wrong. In the bear's powerful jaws was something small, wrapped in what looked like cloth. Jack squinted, his pulse quickening. It wasn't prey, it was a child. His mind raced. How had a baby ended up in the middle of the forest? And why was the bear carrying it? His instincts screamed at him to intervene, but one wrong move could mean disaster for the child. Jack's heart pounded as he took slow, calculated steps forward. He knew he had to approach carefully, earn the bear's trust, but time was running out. Then, something unexpected happened. The bear stopped, lowered its head, and gently placed the baby onto the snow. Jack's breath hitched. This was his only chance. If he moved too fast, the bear could react aggressively. If he hesitated, the baby could freeze in the bitter cold. As Jack locked eyes with the grizzly, he made a decision that would change his life forever. The world seemed to slow as Jack stood frozen in place, the icy wind cutting against his skin. He barely noticed the sting of the cold. His entire focus was locked on the massive grizzly bear standing just a few feet away. The forest ranger had encountered many wild animals in his years patrolling the Yukon wilderness, but never under circumstances like this. Before him lay a helpless human infant, wrapped in tattered cloth, barely moving. The grizzly bear, a towering creature with thick brown fur dusted in snow, stood protectively over the child. Its deep, dark eyes locked onto Jack, and in that moment, a silent battle of trust and fear began. Jack knew the dangers. Grizzlies were unpredictable, especially in the winter when food was scarce. A desperate bear could lash out at any moment. But this wasn't a typical grizzly encounter. There was no aggression in its stance, no warning growl, no signs of hostility. Instead, the bear seemed distressed. Jack carefully assessed the situation. His training told him to back away slowly, avoid eye contact, and never make sudden movements. But his instincts screamed at him to do the opposite, to step forward and save the child before it was too late. He took a cautious step forward, crunching the snow beneath his boots. The bear huffed loudly, shifting its weight slightly, but it didn't charge. Jack swallowed hard. Was it protecting the baby? Had it somehow taken the child in as its own? The thought was absurd, yet the evidence was right before his eyes. Jack tried something he had never done before. He spoke. "It's okay," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you or the baby." The bear snorted, shaking snowflakes from its fur. Its massive head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand him. Jack's heart pounded against his ribs, but he held his ground. The infant stirred on the ground, letting out a weak, pitiful cry. Jack's breath hitched. The baby was alive, but barely. Time was running out. If he didn't act soon, the freezing temperatures could claim the child's life. He took another step forward. The bear let out a deep, rumbling growl, but still didn't attack. Jack knew he was testing fate, walking a razor-thin line between life and death. But something in the bear's eyes told him that this wasn't a fight, it was a plea for help. Jack extended his hands, palms facing outward, showing he had no weapons. "I just want to help," he whispered. And then, the unthinkable happened. The grizzly stepped back. It was only a few inches, but the movement sent shockwaves through Jack's body. He felt his pulse hammering in his throat. The bear's retreat was a silent signal, not surrender, but permission. Jack seized the opportunity. With slow, deliberate movements, he knelt beside the baby. The tiny body was ice-cold to the touch, and Jack could barely hear its ragged breaths. He needed to get the child somewhere warm, fast. But as he reached down to lift the infant, the grizzly bear let out a sharp, guttural noise, making him freeze. For a horrifying moment, Jack thought he had misread the situation, that the bear had only lured him close to attack. His muscles tensed, ready to fight for his life. Then the bear did something unexpected, it turned away. Jack watched in shock as the massive creature lumbered a few steps back toward the trees. It paused, then looked back at him, its eyes deep with something Jack couldn't quite explain. It almost seemed like the bear was waiting. Then he saw it, another figure, small and weak, struggling through the snow. Jack's stomach dropped. It was another bear cub. Jack's mind reeled. Was this why the grizzly had acted so strangely? Had it been torn between saving its own cub and protecting the human baby? He looked at the bear, then at the infant in his arms. He was standing in the middle of both a miracle and a tragedy at once. With no time to waste, Jack knew what he had to do. Holding the baby tightly against his chest, he took a deep breath and made the only decision that made sense. He followed the bear. Jack's mind raced as he followed the massive grizzly bear through the thick snow, clutching the infant tightly against his chest. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to take the child and run for safety, but something deep inside told him that this bear wasn't leading him into danger, it was leading him toward answers. The forest was eerily silent except for the crunch of snow beneath Jack's boots and the labored breathing of the grizzly's second cub, which struggled to keep pace with its mother. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. He was tracking a full-grown grizzly bear with an infant in his arms. It was the kind of scenario that should have ended in disaster, and yet the bear had done nothing to harm him. Instead, it had stepped aside, had allowed him to take the child, and now it seemed to be guiding him somewhere. Jack glanced down at the baby. Its tiny body shivered violently against him, but there was a flicker of life in its half-closed eyes. He pulled his thick coat tighter around the infant, shielding it from the biting cold. Then, suddenly, the bear stopped. Jack stiffened, gripping the child even tighter. They had reached a narrow ravine where jagged rocks jutted out from the snow-covered earth. At the bottom, a frozen creek snaked through the valley, its surface glistening under the pale winter sun. And there, near the edge of the creek, lay something Jack wasn't prepared for. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted a wrecked car, half buried in snow. The windows were shattered, the metal twisted from an apparent impact. The scene was eerily quiet, untouched by human hands, a graveyard of a tragedy lost in the wilderness. Jack's stomach clenched. Had this been where the baby came from? His legs carried him forward before he could think twice. He needed to know. Carefully, he navigated the icy terrain, making his way toward the wreck. The closer he got, the clearer the details became. The car had clearly skidded off the ravine, plunging down into the frozen valley below. Snow had begun to cover the damage, but the truth was undeniable. Jack exhaled sharply. Then, movement caught his eye. Near the wreck, two lifeless bodies lay partially covered in snow. Jack's throat tightened. He had seen enough tragedies in the wilderness to recognize what had happened here. A family, likely lost in the storm, had veered off course and crashed into the ravine. And somehow, the baby had survived. Jack's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the child. His heart ached for the people who had died, but at that moment, he needed to focus on the living. Then, the grizzly let out a deep, mournful huff. Jack turned and saw the bear standing just a few feet away, its massive head lowered as if paying respect to the fallen. Jack understood in an instant the bear must have found the wreck first. And instead of attacking, instead of treating the child as prey, it had taken the baby in, protected it, kept it warm. Jack felt his throat tighten. The bear had been guarding the last surviving member of this family. His vision blurred for a moment, but he had no time to dwell on emotions. The baby needed medical attention, fast. Jack turned back toward the bear, who was now watching him with deep, unreadable eyes. There was a connection between them now, a silent understanding. He exhaled and spoke softly. "I'll take care of the baby," he murmured. The bear huffed once, then turned its gaze toward its struggling cub. The second baby bear was weak, exhausted. Jack realized then that the mother grizzly had been torn, protecting two helpless creatures at once. Jack looked at the infant in his arms, then at the cub, whose breaths were labored and unsteady. Could he save them both? A decision had to be made. Jack inhaled deeply, then tightened his grip on the child and stepped forward toward the grizzly cub. He wasn't leaving anyone behind. Jack could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he crouched down, the weight of the human infant pressing against his chest. The baby's soft, rhythmic breathing was a reminder of just how fragile life was. And now, he was about to make an unthinkable choice. Not only was he determined to save this child, but he couldn't walk away and leave the grizzly cub behind. The mother bear remained still, her deep brown eyes locked onto him. She didn't growl, didn't advance, but she was watching. Jack took a slow breath. Every instinct told him that getting too close to a mother grizzly's cub was a death sentence. But this was different. This bear had already broken the laws of nature by protecting a human child. And now, Jack was about to do the same for her cub. With his free hand, he reached out cautiously toward the shivering bear cub. The tiny creature barely reacted, it was too weak. Jack's throat tightened. If he didn't act fast, this cub wasn't going to make it. Still keeping his movements controlled, he carefully scooped the cub into his arms, cradling it next to the baby. The little bear let out a weak, high-pitched whimper, pressing its cold nose against Jack's jacket. Jack braced himself, fully expecting the mother bear to react, but instead, the grizzly just stood there, her massive body heaving from exhaustion. Then something extraordinary happened. The mother grizzly stepped forward, and instead of attacking, she lowered her massive head and sniffed both the child and her cub in Jack's arms. Jack held his breath. This was the moment of truth. The bear let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a sigh and a growl. Then, to Jack's shock, she turned away. She was letting him go. Jack blinked, barely able to process what was happening. He had expected a fight, a struggle, not this silent surrender. But there was no time to question it. The wind was picking up, and he knew that if he didn't move now, neither the cub nor the baby would make it through the night. Adjusting his grip, he turned on his heel and started trekking back towards civilization. Jack stood frozen, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The massive grizzly bear remained between him and the baby, watching him with an intensity that made his heart pound. The child, wrapped in a thin cloth, let out a weak cry, barely audible over the howling wind. Jack clenched his fists. He had to act, and he had to act fast. The grizzly had protected the baby until now, but why? Jack took slow, measured steps, his instincts screaming at him to tread carefully. He had dealt with wild animals before, but this situation was unlike anything he had ever encountered. How do you reason with a beast that could end your life in seconds? Then the bear did something unexpected. Instead of charging or growling, it let out a low, mournful sound, almost like a whimper. Jack had never heard a grizzly make a noise like that before. It wasn't a warning, it was sadness. That's when Jack noticed something else. The bear's ribs were showing, it looked underweight, its fur dull, its movements sluggish. It was starving. Jack's mind raced. Could the bear have lost its cubs? Could it have mistaken the human child for one of its own? He had heard stories before, cases where animals took in orphans, raising them as their own. Was this what had happened? The realization sent chills down his spine. The bear had been trying to protect the baby. Jack knew he had only one option. He had to gain the bear's trust if he wanted to save the child. Slowly, Jack reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his emergency food, a piece of dried meat and a protein bar. He tore the packaging, the scent drifting toward the bear. The grizzly sniffed the air, taking a hesitant step forward. Jack knelt and placed the food a few feet away, carefully pushing it toward the bear. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the bear moved forward, its massive paws crunching the snow. It lowered its head, sniffed the food, and took it into its powerful jaws. Jack watched as the grizzly chewed, a sign that it was beginning to trust him. Jack knew this was his moment. If the bear was willing to take food from him, it might be willing to let him take the child. He took another slow step forward. The bear watched him but did not move. Holding his breath, Jack knelt beside the baby and gently picked it up. The child's skin was cold, too cold. He had to get it warm fast. He wrapped his coat around the baby and held it close to his chest, shielding it from the icy wind. Jack took a slow step back, then another. The bear just watched. Jack didn't turn his back until he was a safe distance away. Then, clutching the baby tightly, he broke into a run, not stopping until he reached the safety of his cabin. Inside, he immediately lit a fire and wrapped the child in blankets. The baby stirred but was still weak. Jack needed help. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, his voice urgent. "I have a child found in the forest. I need medical assistance immediately. The radio crackled. Repeat that, Jack. Did you say a child? Jack took a deep breath. Yes, and you're not going to believe what happened. Jack sat near the fireplace, holding the baby close to his chest, listening to its faint breaths. The warmth from the fire had started to return color to the child's pale cheeks, but Jack knew the baby was far from safe. It was still weak, its tiny fingers barely moving, its breathing uneven. His instincts screamed that every second counted. He reached for his radio with urgency, his voice firm and commanding. I have a child found in the forest. I need medical assistance immediately. A static-filled pause, then a voice crackled through. Repeat that, Jack. Did you say a child? Jack's heart pounded. Yes, and you're not going to believe what happened. He quickly relayed the bizarre details, the grizzly bear carrying the baby, its strange protective behavior, and the fact that he had managed to retrieve the child safely. But the other end of the radio fell silent. Jack, the voice returned, hesitant. Are you sure about this? Jack gritted his teeth. Why was everyone doubting him? He had risked his life, confronted one of nature's most powerful predators, and now he had a helpless child in his arms. This was no hallucination. I need an ambulance now. His tone left no room for argument. Finally, after a moment, the voice responded, understood. We're dispatching emergency responders to your location. ETA, 15 minutes. Jack exhaled heavily, his breath still shaky. He turned his attention back to the baby. The child stirred in his arms, letting out a faint whimper. Jack's heart twisted. He had so many questions. Who was this baby? How had it ended up alone in the forest? And why had the grizzly bear been protecting it instead of harming it? His mind raced through the possibilities. A lost child from a nearby village? No, this far into the wilderness, it was unlikely. A missing person from a hiking group? Maybe, but wouldn't there have been a search party? Then the most terrifying thought crossed his mind, what if the baby had been abandoned? Jack clenched his jaw. He had seen the worst of human cruelty before, poachers, illegal trappers, people who discarded animals like trash. But a child? No. He refused to believe it. A faint noise outside snapped him from his thoughts. He turned toward the window, his heart pounding once again. And then he saw them, golden eyes glowing from the edge of the forest. The grizzly bear was still there. Jack's breath hitched. The massive creature stood at the tree line, watching the cabin, unmoving. Its posture wasn't aggressive. It wasn't trying to approach. It just stared. A cold realization settled over Jack. The bear wasn't here to reclaim prey, it was watching over the child. But why? Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the distant roar of an approaching vehicle. He turned to see headlights cutting through the snowy darkness. The rescue team had arrived. He quickly pulled open the door as paramedics rushed toward the cabin. The lead medic, a woman named Lisa, froze the moment she laid eyes on Jack, his clothes torn, his face covered in scratches, and in his arms, a tiny swaddled baby. "My God," Lisa whispered. "Where, how did you?" "No time," Jack said firmly. "The baby needs warmth. He's been exposed to the cold for too long." Lisa and her team sprang into action, wrapping the infant in specialized thermal blankets and checking its vitals. Jack hovered, his pulse pounding, watching as they worked. "He's cold but stable," Lisa finally said, glancing at Jack. "You saved him." Jack exhaled, his body sagging with relief. But as he turned toward the forest again, his breath caught in his throat. The bear was still there. Lisa followed his gaze and gasped. "Is that?" Jack nodded. "That bear protected the baby. I don't know how or why, but it did." The paramedics exchanged wary glances. A wild animal had cared for a human infant? It sounded impossible. But Jack knew what he had seen. The grizzly, standing in the shadows, remained motionless. It didn't run. It didn't growl. It simply watched. Jack felt something deep in his chest, a silent understanding. This bear, for whatever reason, had seen the child as its own. And now, watching as Jack handed the baby over to human caregivers, it understood that its role was over. Jack took a slow step forward toward the edge of the porch. The bear's ears flicked, acknowledging his movement. For a brief second, the two locked eyes again. Then, with one final grunt, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees. Jack watched until the last trace of the creature was gone. Would he ever see it again? He didn't know. But one thing was certain, this night had changed him forever. Behind him, Lisa spoke. "We'll take the baby to the hospital. Are you coming with us?" Jack hesitated. His body screamed for rest, his muscles aching from exhaustion. But his heart was still racing. He needed to know the truth. "Yes," Jack said, determination flaring in his chest. "I'm coming." As he climbed into the ambulance, his mind churned. How had this happened? Where had the baby come from? And why had the bear chosen to protect it? Jack knew one thing for sure, this was far from over. The ambulance sped through the snow-covered roads, its sirens slicing through the quiet night. Jack sat in the back, watching as the baby's tiny chest rose and fell beneath the thermal blankets. The paramedics worked swiftly, checking vitals, monitoring oxygen levels, and ensuring the child was stable. Jack couldn't take his eyes off the baby, so small, so fragile, yet somehow, it had survived against all odds. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, the bear, the baby, the strange connection between them. He had spent years patrolling the wilderness, studying the behavior of grizzlies, but nothing could explain this. Why did the bear protect the child? The thought haunted him. The hospital came into view, a beacon of warmth and safety in the cold, unforgiving wilderness. As soon as the ambulance stopped, a team of doctors and nurses rushed forward, carefully transferring the baby to an incubator. Jack followed closely behind, his heart pounding. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights made him squint. The beeping of machines, the hurried footsteps of medical staff, it was all a stark contrast to the silent, snow-covered forest he had just left. Jack stood by as the doctors examined the baby. One of them, Dr. Roberts, turned to him. "You're the ranger who found him?" Jack nodded. "Yes." Dr. Roberts sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You saved this child's life. If you had been even an hour later, I don't think he would have made it." Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. "Will he be okay?" The doctor nodded. "He's stable, a little dehydrated and cold, but no permanent damage. You got to him just in time." Jack exhaled, relief washing over him like a tidal wave, but the questions still lingered. The police arrived shortly after, launching a full investigation. How had the baby ended up in the middle of the forest? Jack sat down with Officer Mitchell, the lead investigator. The man was skeptical at first, a grizzly bear protecting a human baby? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale. But Jack told the story exactly as it happened. The bear had carried the child. It had placed him down gently. It had watched over him, never showing aggression, only a strange, almost maternal protectiveness. Mitchell frowned. "And you're sure there were no parents nearby?" Jack shook his head. "None. No tracks, no signs of a camp. It was just the bear and the baby." The officer scratched his chin. "That doesn't make sense. A baby can't just appear in the middle of the woods. Someone must have left him there." Jack felt his stomach twist. The idea that someone had abandoned the child in the freezing forest was almost too horrible to comprehend. But what other explanation was there? The authorities combed through missing person reports, checking for any signs of a lost or kidnapped infant. But as days passed, no leads emerged. It was as if the baby had come from nowhere. Jack, however, couldn't stop thinking about the bear. A week later, Jack found himself back in the wilderness. He needed answers. The snow had melted slightly, revealing the very spot where he had first seen the grizzly bear standing over the baby. The area was eerily silent. Jack scanned the trees, hoping, no, expecting, to see the bear watching him from a distance. But there was nothing. For the first time in days, Jack felt the weight of everything sink in. Had the bear left for good? Would he ever see it again? As if answering his thoughts, a deep, familiar growl echoed through the trees. Jack turned, his pulse skyrocketing. And there it was. The grizzly bear stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. Not aggressive. Not afraid. Just watching. Jack felt a strange sense of closure. He took a step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why you did it, but thank you." The bear huffed, its golden eyes reflecting something almost knowing. Then, slowly, it turned and lumbered back into the wilderness. And just like that, it was gone. Jack returned to the hospital later that day, standing outside the nursery window, watching the child sleep peacefully. He had been checking in on the baby every day since the rescue. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was responsibility. Or maybe it was something deeper. Dr. Roberts approached him. "You know, social services is still looking for a guardian." Jack turned, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Dr. Roberts smiled. "You saved that child's life. If you wanted to, you could give him one." Jack's chest tightened. He had never considered being a father. He lived alone, deep in the mountains. He was a ranger, his life was the wild. But then he thought about the bear, about how it had done the impossible, how it had protected something that wasn't its own. Maybe, just maybe, Jack was meant to do the same. He looked back at the sleeping baby and made a decision that would change his life forever. Jack formally adopted the child months later. He named him Eli, meaning, protected by God. The story of the grizzly guardian spread through the town, becoming local legend. People whispered about the forest spirit that saved a child, about the ranger who followed its lead. Jack never saw the bear again. But every now and then, when walking through the woods, he'd find fresh paw prints near his cabin, a silent reminder he hadn't been the only one watching over Eli. This story is a powerful reminder that acts of kindness can come from the most unexpected places, even from nature itself. If this story moved you, remember, compassion and courage can change lives. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes in the incredible power of fate, nature, and second chances. Thank you for watching. Until next time.